have my figure ground positive and negative space sketches finished, and a lot of these were kind of warm-ups that I would take an idea and transform into something a little bit more complex. Looking at these, this one doesn't have enough variety and it's fairly simplistic. This one also doesn't have enough variety. This type of design is very similar to this type of design. This sketch is too symmetrical and the same on both sides. This one is interesting, but again, it's a little bit too symmetrical. This one is way too simplistic. Looking at these sketches, I've decided to go with this design. The great thing about doing thumbnails is that you can take components of things that are working well in each of your sketches to then combine into one design that has a lot of successful components in terms of variety of shape and line, leading lines to a point of emphasis, and good balance of positive and negative space. These might be a little bit hard to see, but these are examples of what not to do. So this has this regular, even line spacing, so you want to have a lot more variety. There's no focal point. It's way too redundant. This one is very symmetrical, and obviously it's very simplistic. This is getting there. We have variety of thicker and thinner lines. This one is also better, but still it's symmetrical. If we divide it diagonally, then it's way too similar. So think about how you can have variety in your design. This is from an older sketchbook that's kind of falling apart, but think about how, if you start with a design that maybe isn't your best, how could you improve it? So all of these shapes are very, very similar. Again, there's not a lot of variety. By changing the scale, by having smaller shapes and larger shapes, maybe having other lines cutting through or like looking like they're going behind, that could add a lot of variety. And now my eye is drawn here toward a focal point. Same thing with this one. Again, all of these lines are nearly exactly the same spacing, even though I was experimenting with this kind of overlapping. But maybe I'm going to change lines from thick to thin, or change so I have some angular lines, or break up a line so that it has different spacing into shapes. This design has no unity. Every single quadrant is different, so even though there is kind of a focal point, it's not going to work in terms of a unified design. This design, again, all of these shapes and lines are nearly exactly the same width, and it's way too symmetrical here. Also remember not to shove your focal point in the corner. You want to have your focal point in those hot spots. Even though these designs are rectangles and we're starting with squares, you can see how I have drawn these rule of thirds lines. So that might help you get started with where to draw the eye to a focal point. By having these leading lines or directional lines to one of these locations, rather than the corner, rather than the center, we're getting a lot more eye movement in, around, and out of your composition. Same thing for this one. Here, I'm using these lines to draw your eyes to your focal point, as well as this one. These sketches are pretty complex. It's really helpful to shade in your design so you can see your balance of positive and negative space. I lightly started with my rule of thirds lines, so I'm looking for ways to draw attention to my focal point in each of these compositions. These are pretty complex. You can certainly get this complex with your designs. You would need an X-Acto knife to cut these out. I do want your designs to be sophisticated and have a level of complexity, but they don't need to be quite this complex, especially if you just have scissors to use at home. That would be really hard to make these designs with only using scissors. You want your level of complexity to be somewhere in between these and these. These are very complex, way too simplistic.